Hi everybody, welcome back, glad you could tune in again. Right back at the start of this little mini-series on the relationship between the Christian faith and science, I began by talking about some conversations that I'd had over the years with people who had assumed really that there is a kind of deep-seated conflict between science and the Christian faith. And often when people talk like that, and you may have had conversations like that yourself, as I remarked in that first video, you've had conversations perhaps with people who are surprised that you could be a Christian because hasn't the scientific worldview, hasn't science itself disproved the Christian faith. If you've had conversations with people like that, often you discover that what they really mean when they say that is something about Charles Darwin's theory of evolution has disproved the Christian doctrine of creation. They're not really thinking so much about science broadly, they're thinking specifically about the origin of life. The assumption is that, well, yeah, we all believed in the Bible, or quite a lot of people believed in the Bible, before Charles Darwin came along, but since Darwin and those who've come after him, we now realise that evolution can explain everything, and therefore there's no need for the Bible's account of things, and in fact it's sort of superfluous ancient mythology that we'd be better off without. It therefore sometimes comes as a surprise to people to discover that within the scientific community there is considerable disquiet over the capacity of the theory of evolution to explain the origin of biological life. Often people who aren't scientists assume that what's going on in the scientific world is all going really quite smoothly, when if you know a little bit more about the scientific world, it turns out that you realise quite quickly that things aren't quite such smooth sailing as it might look like from the outside. And I'm afraid I think that many people who aren't professional scientists themselves and aren't Christians have a fairly simplified view of the power of the theory of evolution to explain biological life as we now see it. It turns out that there are some very, very serious shortcomings of the theory of evolution which are acknowledged even by scientists who aren't Christians. And that's the important point to make here. Obviously, as Christians, we have additional reasons for doubting the theory of evolution. But even if you imagine yourself for a moment not being a Christian, if you can do that just for the sake of argument, just for the sake of thinking through the issues, imagine yourself trying to put together a theory of evolution which explained things without recourse to divine creation. I want to suggest that you'd run into a couple of very, very serious problems. I don't want to explain what they are, because articulating these problems is often a very helpful way to engage with people who themselves don't believe the Bible, but they have rather too much confidence in science or the theory of evolution, and just to shake some of that unwarranted confidence can be a helpful way to open up conversations about the scriptures and about our faith and about an alternative and more comprehensive way of looking at the world. So then, what are these problems even within the secular scientific world in relation to the theory of evolution? Well, there are a couple. The first is fairly obvious. It concerns the origin of life properly understood. You may know that the theory of evolution seeks to explain how an organism that can reproduce itself already could progressively, over time, give rise to other organisms which are increasingly complex and so on. So you could start with a very simple self-replicating organism and end up with more complex things like cats and cows and camels and human beings. Well, of course, what that presupposes is that you have a self-replicating organism to start with. If you do have one, then, well, theoretically, you've kind of ticked that first box. Now you could see what evolution could do. We'll come to that in a second. It turns out it can't do quite what's claimed for it. But before you can even get your first foot on the ladder, you've got to get the first rung there. And what you can't do is appeal to the theory of evolution to provide it for you. Somehow, we have to come up with a way of explaining how the first self-replicating organism can have come into existence, and it cannot have evolved. So where did it come from? The problem here is that it's actually quite difficult to construct a self-replicating entity. They turn out to be quite complicated, and so what we end up with is mathematical or probabilistic arguments which attempt to explain how likely it is that one of these things could just come into existence on its own by chance. And the numbers are not very promising. You remember in the previous video I talked about the staggering improbability of the universe that we now perceive coming into existence by chance. Well, you get similar kinds of results if you try and calculate the chance of assembling a self-replicating entity just by chance, just by random processes. Stuart Kaufman comments, anyone who tells you that he or she knows how life started on Earth is either a fool or a knave. Nobody knows. It's just worth thinking about that for a moment or two. But even leaving that aside, you have a problem explaining the process of evolution, even if you could get it started. The assumption is that once you've got something that's simple, then through a series of random processes, it could progressively become more complex. A simple form of life could give birth to, so to speak, a more complex form of life, and that the interaction with its environment would ensure preferential reproduction for organisms more suited to their environment and so on, and that more complex structures like eyes and bones and so on would eventually evolve because of the random processes of evolution being acted upon by the pressure of the environment. Trouble is, that makes claims about information contained within the DNA code of living cells which cannot be substantiated mathematically. What it amounts to is the claim that you can start with a very, very simple string of DNA code, coding for a very simple organism, and through random processes end up with a more complex and longer string of code without putting any external information in. And without wanting to get too complex and into all the mathematics, it turns out that that just ain't so. It isn't true that you can start with a simple string of information, the DNA, which codes for a simple organism, and end up with a longer, more complex one through random processes. There's a whole bunch of maths that's been done on this. It dates back actually to some work by a chap called Claude Shannon in the mid-20th century, who did some work on information theory, and that actually was part of the telecommunications revolution. How can you transmit data through noisy signal lines and so on? But his results have implications for other areas of information theory, and life is, in a sense, information insofar as it's viewed by secular materialists who regard it simply as what DNA codes for. To cut through all the complexity a little bit and to simplify, it turns out you can't start with something biologically simple and end up billions of years later with something biologically complex without an external input of information. And so the question arises, well, why are people so resistant to change? Why are people so resistant to this? Why is this not more widely known? I've often wondered that myself. And it turns out, I'm afraid, that the biological community is really quite stubborn in its resistance to challenge in relation to anything connected with the theory of evolution, perhaps because they realise the implications. There's a story of a Chinese paleontologist called, I'm going to mispronounce his name probably, but Junyuan Chen, who went to a conference in the US in 1999, and he'd done some work on fossils in China, which was not at all challenging the theory of evolution in any dramatic way. He was a secular, reductive materialist, like all of his colleagues at that conference, but he was just challenging one or two points that they had made in their previous work, and he got a very cool reception. He was puzzled by this and asked his host, well, what's going on? Have I missed something? People didn't really seem to like my paper. Did I say something wrong? And his host said, yeah, the trouble is American scientists don't like to hear such challenges to evolution. And Dr. Chen's response is priceless, I think, and it illustrates something about the difficulties of getting a hearing in the scientific community. He said, it's funny, in China we can criticise Darwin, but not the government. In America you can criticise the government, but not Darwin. And one wonders whether there's more truth in that than even he realised. Anyway, to cut a long story short, it's actually not true that within a secular, reductive, materialist worldview, the theory of evolution can stand up to any of the substantive claims that are made for it, quite apart from the additional reasons that we as Christians would have for calling that theory into question. Hope that's helpful and perhaps interesting to prompt some more thoughts. For now, the Lord bless you, and bye for now.